Today's episode of the Energy Question podcast is brought to you by Enverus. The energy industry faces challenges every day, and the events of the last 2 years have caused massive disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Enverus is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Enverus has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Enverus.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. My special guest today is Ben Shepperd, the president, the CEO, the grand poobah of the Permian Basin Petroleum Association, a wonderful organization based in Midland with another office in Austin that does all the great work for the oil and gas industry in America's and really the world's busiest oil and gas producing basin. Ben, how are you doing today?
David, I'm doing great. It's good to be with you. We've known each other a long time. You don't look like you've aged today.
Neither do you.
Yeah.
We'll both pretend.
That's right. That's right.
Hey,
Thanks,
before we get into the question and answer part of this, why don't you just tell people a little bit about the association and what you do to support the industry out there in this really important part of the world for everybody.
Sure, David, thanks. And we are the Permian Basin Petroleum Association that was formed in 1961, representing the Permian Basin of Texas and New Mexico. And so as such, we had a unique and continue to have a unique perspective and sort of set of job duties that come our way. We sometimes known as just a small regional trade, but these days, David, I think most people have actually heard of the Permian Basin.
I think so, yeah.
When I started in 2006, everybody was really happy to be producing those, 50 barrel a day vertical wells and there's lots of legacy production, lots of historic fields and that sort of thing. But it was slow and steady.
Yep.
I think around just under 1 million barrels a day for the entire state of Texas in that time frame. And so, fast forward to the Obama administration and the 2008-9 time frame and some of our local operators that finally figured out how to break through the impenetrable shale and which changed the entire ball game. And so we work on the typical trade association issues. The good and the bad of that is we have a very different political environment, regulatory environment in Texas as we do in New Mexico. Great different political leadership, checkerboard federal land, state lands over there, where we enjoy mostly private lands in the Permian in Texas. And Of course, the other big thing that's on everybody's radar nowadays is the federal issues coming our way that are a relatively new phenomenon in the last decade or so.
Right, and all that federal land out there in the Permian in Lee and Eddy County in New Mexico is really the part of the basin that potentially the Biden administration's permitting rules and all sorts of other regulatory efforts can really have a major impact on, right?
There's no question, David, and it's obviously been a target of the Biden administration since day one, when they put their moratorium on permitting and then gone back and forth, and now permitting is allowed but delayed, and then there've been challenges by NGOs, so whether or not they've considered NEPA properly and things like that, and so the administration and their allies are throwing up a multitude of obstacles, particularly on federal lands, which is a real challenge for the state of New Mexico. I mean, oil and gas is huge, a huge part of their economy and state budget. Up to 40% of their state budget comes from oil and gas taxes.
Right.
I mean, I'm no mathematician, but that's almost half.
That's a lot. And they funded free education at college education and stuff like that with
free
all
college
that
for
money.
everybody, David.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's fantastic.
And then you have a strong contingent of progressives in the state legislature, and those legislators, we expect it next session. We've seen it the last several sessions. Put very punitive legislation and try to move that across the goal line that would essentially outlaw oil and gas. And so why do people continue to mess with New Mexico when there's such a strong contingent headwinds of opposition?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we in Eddy County have the best rocks in America.
Exactly.
They have, without a doubt. The geology over there is unquestionably what is worth the extra work and the extra heartache.
Somebody asked me the other day, and just as an aside on pipeline permitting, has there been any problems with FERC on permitting any pipelines going between New Mexico and Texas, trying to move Permian Basin oil or gas in between the states? And, I didn't know the answer to that. I'm wondering, have you seen anything like that taking place out there?
Well, the short answer is, and I don't want to jinx anything, but I have not seen any major permits denied or unreasonably delayed.
Good.
Doesn't mean that there aren't some difficult conversations going on. I'm just not privy to any knowledge that any of them have been blocked.
Well, that's good. I mean, if it had happened, we'd know about it, I'm sure.
That's right. That's right. It's critical to get from the producing areas, down to the coast or the Cushing or wherever we need to go with it.
Right.
And
right. Another thing that's happened here just recently is the Railroad Commission published these new rules on weatherization. So here in Texas, of certain natural gas facilities that are integrated with the power grid, supply gas to some of the power plants around the state. And I wonder what the reaction has been from your members. Do they feel like the rules well structured? Are they going to have any big issues with trying to comply with what's out there right now?
Well, let me just take us back to February, 2021. It was a nightmare for everybody. I mean, people lost power. People, unfortunately, people lost their lives. People lost water for days, and it was a real challenge. And the legislature and everybody in industry, from upstream to downstream, has been focused on it ever since, and it continues and will continue into the next few years as we try to make sure that those kinds of issues never happen again. So SB 3 was the primary vehicle addressing winterization, passed in the last legislative session, whereby I think we counted 38 different potential rules that came out of that needed to be developed at the agency level. About a third of those at the commission, about a third of those, or roughly a third and a third with PUC and ERCOT. So never before have we seen, frankly, that many rules come at us simultaneously on a related subject matter. So it has been an extraordinary learning curve. Many of us who worked in oil and gas for decades found ourselves having to quickly become more knowledgeable on the electricity markets and those kinds of things, inner workings of some different agencies we hadn't been as familiar with. And so that's been a challenge for operators to adjust to. That being said, the primary issues that with respect to the Railroad Commission and winterization have recently been, one of them has been adopted, and the other one is been reopened. The 365 rule has been reopened for for public comment. I think once that they had initially passed it, and it did a number of things, including trying to determine which facilities were critical. And
Right.
I think we and a number of operators were concerned that they cast too wide a net during, and the threshold was really low, 50 MCF a day, considered you critical. And so what it would have done if you'd left that big universe as critical and then therefore required to winterize, the economics would not have worked out for a lot of marginal wells, and you would have actually reduced supply of natural gas rather than increased it. So we worked with the commission. The commission's reopened that rule. We like where they're going now. Certainly there are costs involved, and there's been quite a bit of confusion. I mean, you've got the mapping committee, which we're not really allowed to see the map, but we'll tell you if you're on it, kind of thing. And then there's been some question about is that map accurate, and the accuracy of the map, accuracy of the data. The Railroad Commission's working on this as diligently and quickly, and staffing up as quickly as it can. I think they had to hire about 100 people just to manage all of this, and that's ongoing. So,
and that's going to be, isn't all of that going to be just an ongoing challenge, right? Making sure the maps are right, just because the wells productions change constantly. New wells are drilled all the time.
Exactly.
I mean, how are you going to how's the commission ever going to keep up with all that? To me, that just seems like an enormous ongoing challenge and all that.
Well, I think it is going to be an enormous, and that's why, I mentioned 100 new FTEs at the commission potentially.
Yeah.
I mean, as you well know, that's a huge number of additional staff for an agency like that has for years been reducing staff.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of concern that we're really only addressing within these rules. Primarily, we're addressing the upstream side of the industry, when I think most folks, if they're honest, will tell you that the biggest problems during the storm in February were that the power was cut off to producers.
Oh, no question.
And on down the chain. And so, I think looking at the downstream, the generator processing part of the map, those are the areas that are obviously most critical.
Right.
And yes, they are also having to implement winterization requirements.
And that's all at the PUC, not the Railroad Commission.
And but it gets into broader questions about that we're starting to have, and they will continue, about market design, storage availability and requirements, and all of these complex market discussions that really don't have anything to do with the upstream producers and even a lot of the pipelines. But there unfortunately has been plenty of finger pointing in the media that I think erroneously.
That was going to be my next question.
West Texas
natural gas got such a horrible bad rap on all
David,
this.
you know how this works. I mean, the oil and gas produced, out in West Texas, for example, it takes days to be processed and shipped down to where the generators and the electric generation is occurring. And, the fact of the matter is also only about 12% of the natural gas produced in the state is used for natural gas production. So then you also get into the questions on reliability and dispatchability and intermittent sources and these kinds of things. And so it's a really complex dialogue going on.
And those are all things, people need to understand, those are all things an oil and gas producer has literally no control over whatsoever, and really no involvement in.
No, right? you sell your gas to a pipeline gathering line, and you don't know where it goes from there, generally speaking. But the media and I think unfortunately some others have tactfully lumped the entire energy industry into one group. As they talk about natural gas being the problem, and what they may mean is generators But who gets blamed is the obvious image of the producer out here, and then people don't know the difference. And so we, have to try to do our best to educate people on how the process works.
And I've written extensively about it and tried to, do what I can to correct that record, but I just so often feel like I'm this voice in the wilderness. I read, stories from some of these big media outlets, Bloomberg, Reuters, the Houston Chronicle, are so factually deficient. I guess I shouldn't say incorrect, but deficient. And just the theme has always been since the day after the freeze, that to try to blame it all on natural gas to avoid telling the truth on how wind and solar failed. And natural gas was really the only thing that kept the grid from completely failing. At one point, I think natural gas was supplying over 80% of the electricity generation on the grid during the depths of that freeze. And had it not been for that, we could have lost the grid entirely. And that would have been the biggest disaster our state has ever faced. But anyway.
No question. And you have done a great job trying to tell that story to anybody who would listen. Appreciate that. So have others. It's a challenge.
It is.
Clearly, there are big dollars involved. And if whatever changes need to be made are going to be quite expensive.
Yeah.
And so the stakes are pretty high. And so playing the blame game, blame it on somebody else, might save you some money down the road.
Right. So as we're recording this in late September, it appears summer's over. The grid has survived, thank God, without any major issues during the depths of summer.
Well, and if I may, though,
go ahead.
If you'll recall, in the springtime, we had a couple of flashing red light warning signs that had nothing to do with the temperature being too cold. What they had to do with was wind wasn't blowing.
Right.
And, some plants were down, and, we were dangerously close to having some problems with the grid in pretty seasonable weather.
Right.
So,
on one of those days, I think it was April 14th, on one of those days, ERCOT's models were predicting they were going to get 12 megawatts from wind, and they got 3 because the wind stopped blowing. Right. I mean, it's so unpredictable. And if you're going to have your grid rely on this unpredictable energy, you're going to have days like that, unfortunately.
So I think my point there is, we're focused totally on winterization here, but we also should be talking about summerization, because obviously the types of techniques that you would use to winterize are not the ones that you use to deal with it when it's 105 degrees out there.
Yeah, exactly.
So, anyhow, that's certainly occupying a large amount of our time and concern.
Oh, I can't imagine. I'm just glad I kind of semi-retired from the industry before all of that stuff happened. So I'm not the one having to deal with all that. I don't envy you that job.
Oh, you'd enjoy it, David. It's a barrel of fun.
It's more fun to just sit around and write about it, man. Hey, so I guess the question then becomes, are we expecting, we got a session coming up in January of the legislature. I wonder, I know you guys try to track, what's likely to happen in the legislature well in advance. Or are you expecting new legislation related to the grid that will have an impact on what you're doing in the Permian?
I think so. I mean, we're just doing some crystal balling here at this point, but I think we can absolutely expect some follow-up, some of which we might support. But I think also there'll be others that really want to take more extreme positions. There'll be some out there that frankly want to do away with SB3 entirely. And, I think they want to put maybe too much blame on the intermittent sources, wind and solar. Right. I mean, they have a place in the mix, and they need to continue to have a place in the mix. And so we're not going to agree to anything like that necessarily, but
Right.
but certainly when it gets to the question of market design, the PUC is under sunset. There will be some questions, no doubt, about, the role of the Railroad Commission vis-a-vis the role of the PUC. I mean, those come up every few years. And I think there are detractors from both agencies. Obviously, PUC is appointed leadership, and the Railroad Commission statewide elected. So we will have some of those discussions potentially about, there's been some ideas thrown around with the state energy plan developed and that's been recently developed, and the Turk group that is going to issue a report, I believe, November 1st. That might have some additional recommendations on how to stabilize the grid and that kind of thing. Some of what we're hearing that may be in there, we probably won't agree with. So, we'll ultimately end up probably have to battle out whether or not we need to have a natural gas desk, for example, at the PUC and ERCOT,
Right.
to look at contracts and things like that. We're our position, frankly, on that is, the generators, the ERCOT and PUC already have authority to look in a confidential manner at, who's buying what gas in what markets, and help on the downstream side figure out, our supply is adequate. Do we need to put more in storage? Do we, we can do those things. I'm not sure we would support any additional, kind of look back into, private contracts beyond what's already available to them that they don't seem to take advantage of.
That would seem to be just another excuse to have the governments kind of interfere in business relationships between two independent, opposing economic parties. And that just, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like a Texas kind of approach to this stuff.
No, and as you know, it's always been, a fun sporting kind of effort to have just the operators and the pipelines themselves communicate clearly in a way that all parties are satisfied. And so, you throw in a government overseer in that, and I'm not sure how much that helps.
Yeah.
And who would run it, and what would they really do? And there's a whole lot of questions we have about some of the ideas being kicked around. And so we'll undoubtedly see a variety of issues.
No doubt.
And we're expecting that. We don't know specifically what we'll see yet, but we're keeping our eyes open and gearing up.
So we got elections coming up in November. Are there any, what are the races that you guys are most interested in out there? Obviously we have all the statewide up, and most of the legislative seats are up, and congressional seats. So it's a big year for Texas.
It's a big year for Texas.
New Mexico, for that matter.
A lot of changes on the Texas front. I think a number of the races at the top of the ticket may be closer than what people would have thought a year ago. But I don't anticipate any major changes at the top, in the statewide. Although could be an upset in there somewhere. But, on the Texas Senate side, you got a couple of House members that have been involved in energy issues on the House side that are going to be in the Senate. Tan Parker, Phil King. And then in Midland, Kel Seliger's decided not to run again from Amarillo. He had the Amarillo Midland district, and did Skip Lubbock. And Kevin Sparks will take that seat, and he comes from the old family small operator background, and certainly will add some oil and gas knowledge and experience to the Texas Senate.
That'll be valuable.
Help and support Dan Patrick over there. So I mean, that will be a bit of a change that we're definitely kind of looking forward to. In New Mexico, I mean, it's the opposite. I think there's Democrats control everything from the governor's office on down, majorities in both houses, all the statewide, and I think that will continue.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think there are, the fights over there, like we have Republican primary fights over here. You have Democrat primary fights over there, and unfortunately, from our perspective, a number of the moderate Democrats, business-friendly Democrats, have been beaten in recent years and months by much more progressive folks who have made clear their antagonism towards oil and gas.
That's just so amazing to me. Not that the progressives are getting elected, but in New Mexico in particular, how do they propose to replace the industry that's providing 40% of their state budget? I just don't understand where they think the money's going to come from if they shut down the Permian Basin. Do they ever talk about that? I mean,
I've certainly not heard any viable alternatives. I'm not sure any exist in the immediate term, of course.
yeah.
So it's a bit of an unrealistic scenario. And frankly, that's one of the things that helps us politically, is that at the end of the session, when all of these bills have made it all the way through the process, everybody has to take that one last look and say, are we really going to do this?
Right.
Because the impact will be extraordinary, and we don't have a way out of the wilderness here. So I don't know how long those arguments, the economic arguments, because there is an extraordinary amount of passion, realistic or not, about the urgency of climate change and the victimization of the entire state. Whether you go back to the Los Alamos nuclear development,
yeah,
World War II,
and there's legitimate complaints about all that
complaints
too.
about mining in general, and now some of the remediation has gone or not gone, and then now it's oil and gas, and unfortunately, and not at the legislative level, but given the leadership and the environmental agencies, when EPA comes out and talks about adding the Permian Basin counties to non-attainment,
what's the status of that, by the way?
Some of the New Mexico conversations we're hearing are, well, they're obviously quite different from what we're hearing from the Texas side. And some folks almost welcome that. I haven't heard any more about that in a couple of weeks. It's
still
percolating. My latest understanding from the governor's office is that he's gotten another letter back from the EPA that didn't articulate any time frame or any additional steps. It just basically reiterated that the EPA has the authority to do this, and they are evaluating it. So, we're working with TCEQ and everybody on, weekly basis, trying to figure out what's going on and what in the world can we do about it. And, all this is occurring in the backdrop where emissions have dropped in the last 10 years by 70%, right?
Yeah, it's just ridiculous.
The arrows are going like this as fast as you could have ever hoped for. And they're continuing because you've got some very stringent methane and emissions requirements that have been implemented in New Mexico. A lot of our operators operate in both states. They're implementing technologies and doing a much better job trying to get down to 98, 99% gas capture. It's happening. They have millions and millions of dollars of investment, and the results are showing. And in spite of all of that, this heavy hand of government, spurred on by the NGOs, who really aren't interested, in my view, they're not interested in clean air, clean environment. They just want to soften the landscape. And it's one of those things. The world would be a much better place if it weren't for all these darn people on it.
I think that's what their argument comes down to at the end of the day.
David, it is. It sounds silly, trite, and everything else, but when you uncover the facts and show them the facts, they're not swayed. They're still convinced that this has to happen. So we're in for a rough few years. And if there may be some changes in the elections at the federal level, in terms of maybe the Republicans can take the House, perhaps. I don't know what's going to happen in the Senate, but at a minimum, you've got the Biden administration for 2.5 more years.
Yeah. So I hate to say this, but we're running out of time, man. This half hour goes too fast, particularly with guys like you that we could talk for hours about this stuff. So I'm going to have to try to get you back on here soon.
David, I would love to do that.
Half a dozen more questions to ask here.
Well, I'll be happy to help. And I appreciate what you're doing, keeping the good word out about sensible energy policies. And thanks for having me.
Hey, man, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the Sandstone Group for playing host to our podcast today, and to, of course, the wonderful people at Enverus for being our title sponsor. That's all for today. We'll see you next time.